The first thing you should know is that silence can be louder than screaming, especially when people think you can't hear it. They started lowering their voices around me the day the doctor said the word hearing loss, dragging it out like a sentence already decided. Mild, he said. Age-related, he said. But my family heard something else entirely. They heard permission, permission to whisper, permission to plan. Permission to speak as if I were already halfway gone. I didn't correct them when I noticed the change. When my daughter leaned closer to my ear and spoke too slowly, as if words themselves had weight. When my son-in-law exaggerated his mouth movements, opening and closing like a fish at the edge of a bowl. When conversation stopped the moment I entered a room, followed by tight smiles and sudden interest in their phones, I let them believe it. Sometimes letting people underestimate you is the safest place to stand. At 82, you learn to observe more than you speak anyway. I have lived in this house for 46 years. I buried my husband from the front porch of it. I raised 2 children inside these walls, scrubbed blood from skinned knees off its floors, counted birthdays and anniversaries and quiet nights when grief sat beside me like an old friend. When my balance started to go, they insisted I move in with my daughter, Claire. Just for a while, she said, until you're steadier. That was 3 years ago. The room they gave me used to be a storage room. It smells faintly of dust and old cardboard, no matter how much lavender I tuck into the drawers. I don't complain. Old women who complain get labeled difficult, and difficult people get ignored faster. It was on a Sunday afternoon when I first heard the truth. They were in the kitchen. I was in my room, folding sweaters slowly, deliberately, because time moves differently when you stop rushing it. The door was open a crack. I remember thinking I should close it, that I didn't want to hear the television noise drifting down the hall. Instead, I heard my name, not spoken kindly, not the way you say someone's name when you're worried about them. She didn't even notice? Claire said. Her voice had that tight edge it gets when she thinks she's being practical. I moved the papers right out of her drawer. A pause. The scrape of a chair. She notices more than you think, Mark replied. My son-in-law, calm, measured, the voice of a man who likes plans. No, she doesn't, Claire said, a little laugh escaping her. Mom barely hears anything anymore. Half the time I don't think she understands what's going on. My hands froze around the sweater. My heart didn't race. It sank. There's a difference. What about the will? Mark asked. There it was. That word. Sharp as a blade sliding free. I checked, Claire said. It's still the old one. Everything split evenly. The house, the savings, all of it. And you? He asked. I'm the executor, she said quickly. Too quickly. But honestly, it's outdated. She wrote it before the fall. Before she moved in. Things change. I leaned against the dresser. My knees felt weak, but my mind was painfully clear. She can't live on her own again, Mark said. You know that. And if something happens, we'll be the ones taking care of everything. It only makes sense. It does, Claire agreed. And she wouldn't even know if we made a few adjustments. She trusts me. That word hurt more than the rest. Trusts. I stepped back from the door then, silently, the way you learn to do when you don't want old floorboards betraying you. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my hands. These hands had fed her, held her through fevers, signed checks for school trips and music lessons. These hands had written that will with careful thought, making sure no one felt favored, no one felt forgotten. And now they were being discussed like obstacles. I didn't cry. Not then. Tears come later, when shock loosens its grip. From that day on, I listened. They never bothered to hide it again. Why would they? To them I was already fading, my senses dulled, my mind soft around the edges. They spoke freely, in the kitchen, in the living room, sometimes right behind me while they thought I was asleep in my chair. "She doesn't need to know about the account," Claire said one evening, stirring a pot too loudly. "It's just sitting there anyway." "We should talk to a lawyer," Mark replied. "See what can be done if she's, not competent." Claire finished for him. There was silence after that, heavy, decisive. At night, in my narrow bed, I replayed every word. Not because I wanted to torture myself, but because memory is power. I began to remember other things too. The way Claire avoided my eyes when I asked about mail that hadn't arrived. How my checkbook always seemed to be somewhere else. How Mark once told a friend on the phone, not knowing I was behind him, that they'd be comfortable soon. Comfortable. Another dangerous word. What they didn't know was that my hearing aid, the one they thought I never used properly, worked just fine when I chose to wear it. And what they didn't know, what they never once considered, was that I had already learned, long before my hearing faded, how quickly love can turn into calculation. My husband taught me that, the year before he died, when he confessed a secret he thought I'd never uncover. But that is another story, and one that prepared me better than they could ever imagine. I am old, yes. My back aches. My hands shake when I write too long. But my mind is intact, sharp as it's ever been, and every word they spoke, every plan they made over my supposed silence, I gathered like stones in my pocket. Because when people believe you cannot hear, they forget something far more important. They forget that you can still see, and they forget that an old woman, when cornered, has nothing left to lose and everything left to decide. By the second week, I stopped counting the days and started counting the lies. They stack quietly, lies do, one on top of another, so thin you hardly notice the weight until the pile collapses. I noticed everything. The way Claire would pause before answering simple questions. The way Mark suddenly became overly helpful, offering to carry my laundry, insisting on managing my medications, asking too casually about important documents. I smiled when expected. I nodded when spoken to slowly. I let my hands tremble a little more than usual. Old age, after all, is the perfect disguise. At night, when the house settled into its false peace, I would lie awake, listening to the familiar sounds, the refrigerator humming, the floor creaking as Mark padded to the kitchen for a glass of water, Claire's soft cough through the wall. These sounds had once meant safety, family. Now they felt like a stage set for something darker. I thought often of my late husband, Harold. He used to say that the worst betrayals never arrive loudly. They slip in wearing familiar shoes. I hadn't understood him then. I do now. One afternoon, Claire sat beside me on the couch, her knee bouncing nervously. The television was on, volume high enough for her comfort, not mine. "Mom," she said, drawing the word out gently, "do you remember signing some papers a few years back? About the house?" I turned my head slowly, squinting a little, playing the part. "Papers?" I asked. "Yes," she said quickly, relief flashing across her face. "Just old stuff. We're thinking it might be easier if everything was updated, simplified." "For who?" I asked softly. She laughed, brushing it off. "For everyone. You know how confusing these things can be. Confusing. As if I hadn't managed finances since before she was born. As if I hadn't balanced checkbooks when calculators were a luxury." I stared at the television screen, pretending to follow a show I'd seen reruns of for years. "If something happened to you," she continued, lowering her voice not enough, "we'd want to make sure things go smoothly. Something happened to you. Such an innocent phrase, wrapped around such sharp intent." I nodded slowly. "You take good care of things," I said. "You always have." Her shoulders relaxed instantly. Trust rewarded. She patted my hand and stood, already moving on, her concern spent. That night, I cried. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. She didn't ask what I wanted. She didn't ask if I was afraid. She didn't ask if I was happy. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being her mother and started being an inconvenience with assets. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but he remembered me immediately. Some people do, especially when you once showed up with every document neatly labeled and every question already prepared. "I need to come in," I said, quietly. He didn't ask why. He just told me when. Getting there was harder than making the decision. I told Claire I was going to the community center for bingo. She smiled too brightly, distracted, already half absorbed in her phone. Mark offered to drive me. I declined. Insisted. I needed the walk, I said. Fresh air. Instead, I took a cab, sitting in that office again, surrounded by familiar wood paneling and shelves of law books. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. I told him everything. About the whispers, the documents moved, the assumptions made. I watched his expression tighten, his pen pause mid-note. "You're certain?" he asked. "I heard every word," I replied. "We went over the will line by line, the accounts, the house." I signed new papers with a steady hand. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of clarity. There is a difference. When I left, copies sealed safely, I felt lighter, even as my heart ached. They never noticed the change in me. How could they? They were too busy planning a future they assumed was already theirs. A few days later, I overheard something that shifted everything. Mark was on the phone, pacing the living room. I sat in my chair, eyes closed, my breathing slow and shallow the way they liked it. "She's declining," he said. "I mean mentally. It wouldn't be hard to prove." A pause. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing." Claire has her under control. Under control. Something cold settled in my chest then. Not fear, but resolve. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about dignity. About being erased while still breathing. That night, I wrote letters. Real ones. With pen and paper. To my other child, my son, who lived 3 states away and hadn't visited in too long, not because he didn't care, but because life has a way of pulling people away until it's almost too late. I wrote to an old friend. I wrote things I wanted known, and then I waited. Because the thing about people who believe you are powerless is that they grow careless, they rush, they underestimate time. And time, when wielded properly, can be a weapon sharper than any confrontation. They thought I couldn't hear. They were wrong, and they were about to learn that silence does not mean surrender. The waiting was the hardest part, not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because patience requires faith, faith that truth, when given enough room, will eventually rise to the surface. Days passed with an uneasy calm. Claire grew more affectionate, hovering just enough to seem caring, not enough to seem suspicious. Mark started coming home earlier, his presence heavier somehow, like a man settling into a role he believed was inevitable. They spoke more freely now, confident. I was slipping further into their imagined fog. One afternoon, I heard them discussing doctors. "We should get her evaluated," Mark said, lowering his voice, though the hallway carried sound beautifully. "A proper assessment. Cognitive decline changes things legally." "I know," Claire replied, "but it has to look natural, not rushed. Natural, as if decay were something you could stage." I sat in my room, staring at the small framed photograph on my nightstand, Harold and me on our 40th anniversary, both of us laughing, wind tangling my hair. He had looked at me that day with something close to awe and said, "You're stronger than anyone I know." I hadn't felt strong in years, but now I remembered. That evening, Claire brought tea to my room. Chamomile, honey, a peace offering. "You've seemed tired lately, Mom," she said, sitting beside me. "Maybe we should have someone check on you, just to be safe." I pretended not to hear, forcing her to repeat it louder. The irritation flickered across her face before she masked it. "Doctor?" I asked finally. "Am I sick?" She smiled too fast. No, just routine." I nodded slowly. "If you think it's best." She squeezed my hand, victorious. When she left, I poured the tea down the sink. 2 days later, my son arrived. They hadn't expected him. I hadn't told them he was coming. I was sitting in the living room when the doorbell rang. Claire answered it, and the color drained from her face. I heard my son's voice before I saw him older, deeper than I remembered, but unmistakably his. "Mom?" he said when he saw me. His eyes searched my face, not with pity, but concern, real concern. I stood. Slowly, yes, but on my own. "Hello, sweetheart," I said. Claire rushed forward. "You didn't tell us you were coming?" she said to him, a brittle laugh escaping. He didn't take his eyes off me. She did. The air shifted then. Something unseen but undeniable. We talked for hours. About his work, his children, things that felt safe. Claire hovered. Mark stayed quiet, watching too closely. At one point, my son leaned close to me and whispered, "You don't sound confused." I met his gaze. I'm not. Later that night, when Claire and Mark thought we were asleep, I told him everything. Not dramatically, not angrily, just facts, dates, words spoken, intentions revealed. I watched his face harden with each sentence, disbelief turning to something sharper. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" he asked softly. "Because I needed to be sure," I replied. "And because sometimes people show you who they are only when they think you're no longer watching." The next morning, my lawyer arrived, unannounced, uninvited. Claire nearly dropped her mug. "What's this?" she asked, voice tight. "Clarity," my lawyer said calmly. We sat at the dining table, all of us. No whispers now, no assumptions. Documents were laid out, copies, dates, signatures. "I am of sound mind," I said, meeting Claire's eyes directly. "I always have been." Mark shifted in his chair. "We were only trying to help." "Help yourselves," I corrected. The silence was thick, suffocating. I revealed the new will, the changes, the safeguards, the witnesses. I watched realization dawn slow, painful, irreversible. "You lied," Claire whispered. "No," I said. I listened. She looked at me then, not as a frail old woman, not as an asset, but as someone she no longer recognized, someone she could no longer control. There were tears, accusations, denials that collapsed under their own weight. My son said little. He didn't need to. That afternoon, I packed my things. I didn't leave with anger. I left with dignity. Now, I live somewhere smaller, quieter. My hearing isn't perfect. My body still aches. But my voice is mine again. People often think aging is a kind of vanishing, a slow erasure. They're wrong. Sometimes it is a sharpening. And the greatest mistake my family ever made was believing that because I was quiet, I was gone. The house I moved into afterward was nothing like the one I'd left behind. No long hallways echoing with other people's plans. No careful smiles. No voices lowered just enough to exclude me. It was a small place on the edge of town, with a narrow porch and a single maple tree that shed its leaves generously every autumn, as if it too understood the relief of letting things go. My son stayed for a week, helping me settle in. He unpacked boxes, argued with the cable company, fixed a loose hinge on the bathroom door. Ordinary things, kind things, the sort of care that doesn't ask for anything in return. At night, after he thought I'd gone to sleep, I could hear him pacing softly, the way he used to as a boy when something weighed on his mind. Guilt, perhaps, or anger, or both. "You should have told me sooner," he said one evening as we sat at the small kitchen table, cups of tea between us. "I told you when it mattered," I replied, "and when I was ready." He nodded, though I could see he wanted to say more. Children often want to fix what has already happened. Parents learn, eventually, that some lessons must simply be carried. Claire didn't call, not that week, not the next. Mark sent a single message, short, stiff, full of words like misunderstanding and intentions. I didn't reply. Silence, when chosen, feels very different from silence imposed. But peace, I discovered, is not the same as rest. At night, memories crept in, uninvited. Claire, as a child, standing on a chair to help me stir soup, her laughter, her hand slipping into mine without thinking. I wondered where that girl had gone. Or maybe this was who she had always been, and I'd been too busy loving her to see the cracks forming. One afternoon, about a month after I moved, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text, a letter. I recognized Claire's handwriting immediately. Careful, rounded, controlled. My hands shook as I opened it, not from fear, but from something closer to grief. She wrote that she felt betrayed, that she had only been trying to protect me, that Mark had pushed, yes, but that I hadn't given her a chance to explain. She said she missed me. She said she hoped I was well. She did not apologize. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer. Some things don't need answers. Some things speak loudly enough on their own. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Mornings with sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor, afternoons reading by the window, evenings when the quiet felt earned rather than empty. My hearing continued to fade, slowly, naturally, but my awareness sharpened. I noticed things more now, the way people choose their words, the way intentions leak out in pauses and glances. It was during one of my weekly visits to the community center that the twist I never expected arrived. I was playing cards with a woman named Ruth, sharp-eyed, quick-witted, younger than me by a decade, but already worn by life. We talked between hands, the way people do when trust builds without effort. "Your daughter used to come here," she said casually, laying down a card. I looked up. "She did?" "Yes," Ruth said, "with her husband. A while back, asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Ruth hesitated, then shrugged. "About assisted living, memory care facilities, what it takes to declare someone unfit." The room felt suddenly smaller. "They said it was for an aunt," Ruth added quickly, "but they kept using your name by accident." I thanked her, my voice steady, though my chest tightened. I went home that day and sat for a long time at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. They hadn't just planned to change papers. They had planned to erase me. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I took out the letters I'd written weeks earlier, the ones I'd tucked away as insurance. I added another. This one addressed to Claire. Not angry, not pleading, honest. I wrote about trust, about how betrayal isn't always loud, and how love doesn't survive being used as a tool. I told her I hoped she would someday understand the line she had crossed, not because I wanted punishment, but because I wanted her to live without the weight of it. I mailed it the next morning. Weeks passed, then months. Claire never replied. But something else happened. A social worker contacted me. Polite, professional, curious. She explained that concerns had been raised previously about my mental capacity, and that a follow-up was required now that my living situation had changed. I laughed softly when she said it, and invited her in. We talked for hours. I answered every question. I showed her my finances, my routines, my medication schedule, My correspondence, she observed. She listened. At the end, she smiled gently. You're one of the most lucid people I've met, she said. I know, I replied. After she left, I sat by the window and watched the maple tree sway in the wind. Its branches were thinner now, leaves fewer, but it stood firm, roots deep, unmoved. That's when I understood something important. The story wasn't over yet, because hearing everything they said about me hadn't just saved me. It had changed me. And the final chapter, the one where truth settles permanently into place, was still waiting to be written. The weeks after the social worker's visit carried a strange quiet, the kind that feels like the pause before a storm, or the deep breath someone takes before saying something irreversible. I went about my days gently, deliberately, as if each small action mattered more now. I watered the plants. I wrote in my notebook every morning, not because I needed reminders, but because writing anchored me. It reminded me that my thoughts were still my own, lined up neatly, sharp and alive. And yet, beneath that calm, something unsettled me. It wasn't fear. Fear is loud. This was something subtler, a low hum of awareness that once someone tries to erase you, they rarely stop at one attempt. They simply learn to be quieter next time. I was proven right on a Wednesday morning. My phone rang just after 9. An unfamiliar number. I let it ring twice before answering. Mrs. Whitmore? A woman asked. Her voice was smooth, practiced. Yes, this is Elaine Porter. I'm calling from the County Legal Aid Office. I wanted to follow up regarding some concerns that were raised about your well-being earlier this year. There it was again. Concerns. Always such a polite word. I was already evaluated, I said calmly. Yes, she replied. Those notes were shared with us. However, a family member has requested a secondary review, citing inconsistencies. Family member. Singular. Not hard to guess which one. I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was tired of pretending to be surprised. I'm available, I said. You're welcome to come by. There was a pause on the line. I imagined she hadn't expected that. Resistance, perhaps, defensiveness, not cooperation. All right, she said. We'll schedule a visit. After the call ended, I sat very still. My hands did not shake. My heart did not race. Instead, a deep, old sadness settled over me. Not for myself, but for the daughter who had once cried in my arms over scraped knees and broken friendships, who now believed the only way forward was to push her own mother aside. I called my lawyer next. Then my son. They came 2 days later, Elaine Porter and a younger man who introduced himself as a trainee. They sat at my small dining table, notebooks open, eyes attentive. The questions were similar to before, but more pointed. Dates, names, decisions. Can you tell us why your daughter believes you're no longer capable of managing your affairs? Elaine asked. I smiled faintly. You'd have to ask her. She says you're forgetful, Elaine continued, that you misplace important items. I misplace my glasses, I said. Sometimes they're on my head. I don't think that qualifies as incompetence. The trainee snorted before he could stop himself. Elaine hid a smile. We went through everything again. Slower this time, more thoroughly. I answered without hesitation. I even told them about my hearing, how it had diminished. Yes, but not disappeared. "And your family is aware of this?" she asked. "They believe what suits them," I replied. At the end of the visit, Elaine closed her notebook. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, "I see no grounds for further concern. In fact, I'll be filing a note recommending that no additional family-initiated reviews be entertained unless there's significant new evidence." "Thank you," I said. When the door closed behind them, I felt something loosen inside me, not relief, validation. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was Claire. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Hello," I said. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked immediately, not in the way of someone grieving, but in the way of someone losing control of a situation they thought they had managed. "I heard from someone at the community center," she continued quickly. "They said you told people we were trying to put you away." "I told the truth," I replied. There was silence, heavy, breathing on the other end. "You didn't have to make this so public," she finally said. Public, as if secrecy had been her shield, and I had dared to pull it away. "You made it public when you spoke about me as if I wasn't there," I said quietly. "When you planned my life without my consent. We were scared," she snapped. "Do you know how hard it is watching you get older? Watching you slip?" "I wasn't slipping," I said. "I was listening." That stopped her. "I heard you," I continued. "Every word, about the will, about the doctors, about memory care. I heard you deciding I was already gone." Her breathing quickened. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I needed to know who you were when you thought I couldn't." Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. Mark doesn't matter," I said gently. "You do." She started to cry then. Real tears this time. Not frustration, not anger. Grief. "I don't know how we got here," she whispered. "I do," I said. "We got here because you forgot that I am still a person." She didn't argue. That told me more than any apology could have. We ended the call without resolution. No forgiveness, no dramatic reconciliation. Just truth, laid bare, raw, and uncomfortable. Afterward, I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. The maple tree rustled quietly, leaves whispering secrets to the wind. I realized then that the shocking twist of my story wasn't the betrayal. It was the clarity. Losing my hearing had sharpened everything else. It stripped away illusions, forced people to reveal themselves, forced me to choose myself without apology. I don't know what will become of Claire, or Mark, or the family I thought I had. Still deciding, and the final part of my life will not be written by whispers spoken over my head, but by the steady, deliberate voice I kept, even when they believed it was gone. The morning I realized I was finally free, nothing dramatic happened. No phone rang, no doors slammed, no voices whispered behind walls. I woke up to sunlight spilling across my bedspread, warm and ordinary, and for the first time in a long while, my chest didn't feel tight when I opened my eyes. That was how I knew something had changed, not outside me, but inside. Freedom I learned, doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, when fear stops waking up with you. I went about my routine slowly. I brewed coffee, the good kind I'd been saving without a reason. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the world as best I could, the distant hum of traffic, a bird calling from somewhere near the maple tree, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I missed some sounds. Others came through just fine. It didn't matter anymore. I had stopped measuring myself by what I lacked. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I knew who it was before I opened it. Claire stood on my porch, eyes rimmed red, hands clasped together like she was bracing for impact. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not younger, smaller. As if the weight she'd been carrying had finally begun to show. "I just wanted to see you," she said. "No excuses this time, no justifications. Just a statement." I stepped aside and let her in. She sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd faced lawyers and social workers and truth. She ran her fingers along the wood grain, avoiding my eyes. "I didn't sleep last night," she said. "I believe you," I replied. She swallowed hard. "I keep hearing your voice in my head, the way you said you were listening. I didn't think... I mean, I really didn't think you understood. That," I said gently, "is the part that hurts the most." Tears slipped down her face then, quiet and unguarded. Not the kind meant to persuade, the kind that arrives when there's nothing left to defend. "I was afraid," she said, "of losing you, of being responsible for you, of everything changing. And so you tried to control it," I said. She nodded. "I became someone I don't recognize," she whispered. I studied her face, the face I had kissed 1,000 times as a child, the face that had once looked at me as if I could fix anything. I felt sadness, yes, but I also felt something steadier, acceptance. "I forgive you," I said. Her head snapped up. "You do?" "Yes," I said, "but forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were." She nodded slowly. She understood that, at least. We talked for hours, about her fears, about my anger, about the space that would now exist between us, not as punishment, but as protection. When she left, she hugged me carefully, as if afraid I might break. I hugged her back just as carefully, aware of my own strength. After that day, the world seemed to widen. I took a trip by myself for the first time in years, just a short one, to a coastal town where the air smelled like salt and memory. I walked along the shore with my shoes in my hand, letting the cold water numb my feet, laughing out loud when a wave caught me by surprise. No one rushed me. No one watched me with concern or calculation. I was just another old woman walking beside the sea, and it felt like a gift. I started volunteering at the community center, helping other seniors organize their paperwork, write letters, make sense of things their families had started to handle for them. I didn't preach. I didn't accuse. I just listened, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. People underestimate the power of being seen. My hearing continued to fade. Some days were better than others. I missed parts of conversations. I asked people to repeat themselves, and sometimes I smiled and nodded when I didn't quite catch every word. But I never missed intention again. That was the real lesson. Near my 83rd birthday, my son called and told me something that made me laugh until my sides hurt. Claire and Mark were separating. Not dramatically, not bitterly. Just the slow realization that a marriage built on control and fear has nowhere left to go once the illusion breaks. "I don't feel guilty," my son said carefully. "You shouldn't," I replied. "Truth has consequences. That doesn't make it cruel." On my birthday morning, I sat alone on my porch with a small cake and one candle. The maple tree had shed most of its leaves by then, branches bare against the sky. It looked fragile to someone passing by, but I knew better. I thought about everything I'd heard, every whispered plan, every careless word spoken over my head. I thought about how close I'd come to being erased not by illness, but by assumption, and I realized something that felt like the final twist of all. They were wrong about my hearing, but they were even more wrong about my worth. Growing old does not make you invisible. It makes you dangerous to lies, to manipulation, to anyone who believes silence means surrender. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the breeze brush my face. I couldn't hear everything anymore, but I had heard enough. Enough to save myself, enough to choose dignity, enough to live the rest of my life on my own terms. And that, more than anything they ever said about me, is the truth that will outlive us all. The years that followed did not rush past me the way the earlier ones had. They arrived slowly, deliberately, like guests who knew better than to barge in unannounced. Each season made itself known in small ways, the maple tree budding stubbornly every spring, the ache in my hands before rain, the way my reflection softened but did not disappear when I passed the hallway mirror. People often ask me now if I'm lonely. They mean well, but the question always makes me smile. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of being heard. And I have never felt more heard than I do now, even when the world sounds quieter than it used to. Claire and I found a careful balance. We speak once every few weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less. Our conversations are honest, but guarded, like two people walking on a bridge they both know can crack if stepped on too hard. She tells me about work, about learning to stand on her own again. I tell her about the garden I started in pots on the porch, about Ruth at the community center who still cheats at cards and laughs when caught. She never talks about the will again. I never bring it up. Some wounds don't need to be reopened to prove they existed. Mark faded from my life entirely. That surprised me less than it should have. People who rely on control rarely stay once it's gone. I heard through my son that he blamed me for everything, for the marriage ending, for the embarrassment, for the life he thought he deserved. I didn't respond. I had learned by then that not every accusation deserves a defense. My son visits often now, not out of guilt, but out of choice. We sit on the porch together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about nothing that matters and everything that does. Once, he asked me if I regretted not confronting them sooner, back when I first overheard those whispers. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "No," I said. If I had spoken sooner, they would have denied it, explained it away, made me doubt myself. By waiting, I learned the truth in full. He nodded, understanding settling into his face. That is something age gives you. If you let it, an understanding that timing can be as powerful as action. My hearing continued to decline. There came a point when the hearing aids helped only a little. Conversations turned into puzzles, missing pieces filled in by context and instinct. Some days it frustrated me. Other days it felt like a blessing. The world is loud with unnecessary noise complaints, excuses, empty reassurances. Losing some of that made room for what mattered. Touch, expression, intention. One afternoon, a young woman sat beside me at the community center, tears streaking her face. She was there with her grandmother, overwhelmed, angry, exhausted. She whispered things she thought the old woman couldn't hear, about money, about burden, about how unfair it all felt. I watched the grandmother's eyes. I leaned toward the young woman and said gently, "She hears more than you think." The girl froze. The grandmother smiled. Later, the young woman thanked me. She said she hadn't realized how cruel she'd sounded. I told her something I now believe with my whole heart. Speak to people as if they will remember your words forever, because sometimes they do. On my 85th birthday, I went back to the house I'd once lived in with Harold. It had new owners now, different curtains in the windows, fresh paint on the porch, but the bones were the same. I stood across the street for a while, memories lining up quietly beside me. I didn't feel sadness. I felt gratitude for the life I'd lived there, for the lessons it gave me, for the strength I didn't know I had until it was tested. That night, back in my small home, I sat down and wrote one final letter, not to Claire, not to my son, to myself. I wrote about the woman I had been, the young wife, the busy mother, the grieving widow, the underestimated old woman. I wrote about what she survived, what she learned, what she deserved. I sealed the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others, not as evidence, as legacy, because one day, when I am gone, and that day will come, as it does for everyone, I want the story to be clear. I was not tricked. I was not erased. I was not silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was listening. And when the moment came, I spoke in the only way that truly mattered, through action, through truth, through choosing myself. If there is one thing I hope people remember, it is this: never assume that age makes someone powerless. Never mistake quiet for confusion. And never believe that because someone hears less, they understand less. Some of us hear exactly what we need to, and we remember every word. The last winter came gently, not all at once, not with drama or alarms, but with small signs that only someone who has lived a long time learns to read. I tired more easily. My hands stayed cold even when wrapped in wool. The maple tree outside my window stood bare longer than usual, its branches thin against a pale sky, but still standing, always still standing. I wasn't afraid. That surprised me most of all. I spent my days the same way I always had: slow mornings, careful movements, deliberate choices. I still went to the community center when I could. I still wrote every morning, even when my fingers stiffened and my handwriting leaned sideways like it was tired too. I cooked less, ate simpler meals. Soup, toast, tea, enough. One afternoon, as snow began to fall softly outside, I felt a weight settle into my chest, not pain, not panic, just a deep knowing, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that waits politely until you notice it. I sat at my small kitchen table and looked around. This place had never been meant to impress anyone. It held only what I needed. The table where truth had been spoken. The chair by the window where I had watched seasons change. The drawer filled with letters, evidence not of wrongdoing, but of a life fully seen. I took out the letter I had written to myself and read it one last time. I smiled at the woman on the page. She sounded braver than she felt sometimes, but she was honest. That night, my son called. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with something he was trying to hide. "I just wanted to hear you." "I'm here," I said. We talked for a while, about nothing important, about the weather, about a story from his childhood neither of us remembered quite the same way. Before hanging up, he paused. "I'm proud of you," he said. I closed my eyes. "That means more than you know." Claire called the next morning. She hadn't called in weeks. When I answered, she was quiet for a long moment. "I was thinking about something you said," she told me. "About listening." "Yes, I've been trying to do it," she said. "Really listen. To people. To myself." I believed her. Not because she said it perfectly, but because she said it carefully. "I'm glad," I replied. "I'm sorry," she added, finally. The words were soft, fragile, but real. "So am I," said. And for the first time, it didn't ache to say it. After we hung up, I wrapped myself in a blanket and moved to the chair by the window. Snow drifted down, slow and steady, covering the ground in quiet forgiveness. The world looked clean, unburdened. I thought of all the words I had heard when people believed I could not. I thought of how easily a life can be rewritten by others if you are not careful. How quickly love can turn conditional when fear enters the room. How dangerous assumptions can be when mixed with impatience. And I thought of how close I had come to disappearing while still breathing. But I hadn't, because I listened, because I waited, because I trusted myself when others didn't. I don't know exactly when I drifted to sleep, or if it was sleep at all. The line between resting and leaving felt thinner than paper. I only know that I felt calm, complete, finished, in the best possible way. If you are hearing this story now, then someone chose to remember it. That matters. Let it be known that I lived my final years not as a burden, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who reclaimed her voice when the world assumed it was gone. Let it be known that silence is not surrender. That age does not erase intelligence. That listening can save a life. My family thought I couldn't hear, but I heard everything. And because I did, I left this world with my dignity intact, my truth preserved, and my ending written by my own hand. That is how I want to be remembered. Not for what I lost, but for what I refused to give away. There is something that happens after a story ends that no one ever talks about. The quiet afterward. Not the peaceful kind people imagine, but a living, quiet one that carries echoes, echoes of words spoken, choices made, paths taken and not taken. It is in that quiet that a life truly settles into meaning. I know this now, because I have felt it. After that winter, after the snow melted and returned again in smaller, gentler falls, I found myself living in what I can only describe as borrowed time, not borrowed in a frightening way, but in a precious one. Each morning felt like an extra page I hadn't expected to get, and I read it slowly, carefully, savoring every line. My body weakened, yes, I will not pretend otherwise. There were days my legs trembled simply walking from the bedroom to the kitchen. Days my hearing failed me, almost entirely, turning the world into a soft blur of movement and expression. But my mind, oh, my mind was clearer than it had ever been. It's strange how clarity arrives when nothing else is left to prove. People from the community center began visiting me. Ruth came most often, bringing gossip and soup in equal measure. She talked loudly, then laughed when she realized she didn't need to anymore because I could read her lips better than she expected. "You know," she said once, pointing a spoon at me, "people listen when you talk, even when you barely speak." That made me smile. My son arranged his life around me in small, quiet ways. He never announced it, never made me feel like an obligation. He just showed up on weekends, on random Tuesdays, with groceries I hadn't asked for and stories I didn't need but loved anyway. Sometimes we sat in silence, watching the light change across the floor, and that silence felt fuller than any conversation. Claire visited again, months later. This time, she didn't come with fear in her eyes or guilt clinging to her words. She came with humility. She sat across from me, hands folded, and waited for me to speak first. That alone told me how much had changed. "I think about you every day," she said eventually. "About what I almost did, about what I could have taken from you." I studied her face, the lines that hadn't been there before, the softness that had returned to her eyes. "You didn't take it," I said. "That matters." She nodded, tears spilling freely now. "I know, and I know I can't undo it. I want you to know I see you. I really see you." That was enough. Not forgiveness in a grand cinematic sense, not absolution, but recognition. Recognition is where dignity lives. We talked about small things after that. The weather, her work, a memory from her childhood she'd almost forgotten. When she left, she hugged me, not like a caretaker hugging a responsibility, but like a daughter hugging a mother. Carefully, respectfully, honestly. After she was gone, I sat for a long time with my eyes closed, breathing slowly. I felt no triumph, no vindication, just peace. I began giving things away, not because I was preparing to die, but because I was finished carrying what no longer belonged to me. Books went to the library, clothes to shelters, letters to people who would understand them. The drawer of old documents, I kept only what mattered, and the rest I let go. One afternoon, I took out the hearing aids and placed them carefully in their case. I didn't need them anymore. By then, sound had become optional. Understanding was not. I spent my final weeks in the chair by the window, watching the maple tree sway through another season. Its branches were thinner now, bark rougher, but when the wind came, it did not bend easily. Roots matter more than appearance. That is another thing age teaches you. On my last evening, the house was quiet. No television, no phone calls, just the steady rhythm of my breathing and the fading light of the day. I thought about the first moment I overheard them, the whispers, the plans, the careless cruelty of assumption. I thought about how close I came to losing everything without ever knowing why. And then I thought about what I gained instead. Myself, the version of me that no longer asked permission to exist, the version that trusted her instincts, the version that listened not just with ears, but with awareness. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Never underestimate the people you think are fading. Never speak over someone simply because they are quiet. Never assume that silence is ignorance. Some of us are silent because we are gathering truth. Some of us are quiet because we are deciding, and some of us, when the moment is right, will rewrite the ending you thought you'd already planned. My family thought I couldn't hear, but I heard every word. And because I did, I lived the rest of my life not as someone waiting to disappear, but as someone who finally belonged, fully and fiercely, to herself. That is not a tragedy. That is a victory. And it is the kind that echoes long after the voice itself has gone quiet. If there is an aftertaste to a life, it is not regret, it is understanding. I felt it most clearly in the final days, when time loosened its grip and moments stretched like long shadows at dusk. People think the end comes with fear or sorrow or some great unfinished ache. For me, it came with a quiet sorting, not of belongings, I had already done that, but of meaning. I understood, at last, that every moment of being underestimated had sharpened me. Every time someone spoke over me, around me, past me, thinking I was no longer fully present, I learned something essential about power. Power is not volume, it is not speed, it is not control. Power is awareness, paired with patience. When you are young, you rush to be heard. When you are old, you choose when hearing is enough. In those final weeks, I slept often. Not the heavy sleep of illness, but the gentle drifting of someone who trusts where she is going. I dreamed of ordinary things, my husband's laugh, the smell of rain on hot pavement, Claire's small hand wrapped around my finger when she was 4 and afraid of the dark. I dreamed of kitchens and porches and quiet rooms filled with unspoken truths. One afternoon, my son sat beside me and read aloud from the newspaper. I didn't catch every word, but I didn't need to. His presence filled in the gaps. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "You know, Mom, you taught me something without ever trying to." I turned my head slightly, inviting him to continue. "You taught me that dignity isn't loud," he said. "It's steady." That stayed with me. Another day, Ruth came by and sat at the foot of my chair. She talked, as she always did, about nothing in particular. Halfway through a sentence, she stopped and looked at me closely. "You're not afraid, are you?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "Good," she said. "You shouldn't be. You did it right." That night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone with the dim lamp on and listened to the silence I had earned. It did not feel empty. It felt full, layered with every choice I had made for myself when others assumed they could make them for me. I thought again about that first day. The doorway, the whispered plans, the way my hands had gone still around a folded sweater. How easily the story could have ended differently. How close I came to being managed instead of respected, handled instead of heard. People like to believe that injustice announces itself clearly, with raised voices and obvious villains. But the most dangerous kind wears a familiar face and speaks in a gentle tone. It says, "We know what's best for you." It says, "You won't understand anyway." It says, "Let us decide." And it counts on your silence to survive. Mine did not. I never raised my voice. I never slammed a door. I never accused until the truth stood firmly enough on its own. I let them reveal themselves while I gathered strength. I chose timing over confrontation, clarity over chaos. That choice saved me. In my final moments of waking, I did not think of money or property or documents signed. I thought of something far simpler. I thought of the moment I chose myself. That is what changed everything. Not the lawyer, not the will, not the social workers or the calls or the apologies that came too late or just in time. The turning point was internal, quiet, decisive. The moment I understood that my value did not diminish because my hearing did. That my worth did not fade because my hair had turned white, that my mind was still mine, my voice still valid, my life still my own. I wish I could tell every woman who has ever been spoken over, dismissed, managed, or quietly erased that this is true for her too. Your silence can be strategy. Your patience can be power. Your age can be armor. If you are listening to this now, know that my story is not unique. It is simply one that was allowed to finish honestly. They thought I couldn't hear, but I heard every word. I heard fear disguising itself as concern. I heard greed dressed up as responsibility. I heard love thinning into entitlement. And because I heard it, I chose differently. That choice followed me all the way to the end, where I did not feel small or forgotten or afraid. I felt complete, a woman who listened, a woman who waited, a woman who decided. And when my voice finally did grow quiet, it was not because it had been taken from me. It was because I had said everything that mattered. Stories like mine don't really end, they settle. Long after the house is quiet, long after the chair by the window sits empty, the truth lingers in the spaces people once underestimated, in the pauses between words, in the way someone hesitates before speaking over another person, in the way a daughter listens more carefully, in the way a son chooses presence over convenience. That is where I remain, not in the paperwork or the letters or the final arrangements, but in the lesson my life left behind. That listening is not weakness. That aging is not erasure. That silence, when chosen, can be the sharpest form of resistance. If someone ever tells my story, I hope they don't tell it as a warning alone. Warnings are easy to forget. I hope they tell it as proof. Proof that dignity can be reclaimed. Proof that clarity can arrive late and still arrive in time. Proof that an ending does not have to be loud to be powerful. I was an old woman whose family thought she couldn't hear, and because they believed that, they showed me exactly who they were. Because I listened, I showed myself who I could still be.